Hello, and welcome to the Classicist podcast from the Hoover Institution. I'm Troy Senek here with the classicist, Victor Davis Hanson, the Martin and Ilya Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And Victor, our conversation today is inspired by a piece that you just published in National Review, in which you try to outline the tenets of the Trump Doctrine, the principles that undergird foreign policy in the Trump administration. And I'll just start us here with your introduction as it appears in the piece, quoting you here. Donald Trump's 2016 campaign sought to overturn 75 years of bipartisan foreign policy orthodoxy, especially as it applied to the Middle East, close quote. Okay, so that, as you explain in the piece, that orthodoxy grew out of the Cold War, but at least some permutation of it has still been with us in the 30 years or so since the Cold War ended. Why don't we start by just having you explain what the defining traits of that orthodoxy were?
Well, it was based in the Cold War on galvanizing the West to resist Soviet and to a lesser extent Chinese communist expansionism. Then after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, it was recalibrated by George H.W. Bush to say that we're still the leader of the free world and we're going to protect and enhance the global world order, and I guess new world order, whatever term he picked at the moment. And what that meant was the assumption was that we were so wealthy and so powerful and now the hyperpower without a rival that we could afford any cost. That meant we wouldn't worry about asymmetrical trade with Europe or Japan or with an ascendant China. And we would sort of mow the lawn, if I could use that metaphor, about something as grisly as death in places like Grenada, or Panama or Nicaragua or Libya or the Bekaa Valley, or more prominently with Saddam or Milosevic, this rogues gallery, we were going to make sure that they did not translate their regional popularity into a threat to the commercial order or the sea lanes or international commerce, and that they wouldn't engage in state-sponsored terrorism. And we could do all that because we, in our infinite wisdom, we knew how to put them down and then to erase the conditions that created them. And that kind of died, I think, when we found out that we were not as strong as we thought we were, or that we were not as good nation builders as we thought we were in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, or more importantly, that China was never going to turn into Greenwich Village or Palo Alto the more concessions we gave to it. And so now we're sort of back to I guess H.R. McMaster's National Security Group called it principled realism.
At one point in the NR piece, you talk about some of the reasons that this previous approach wasn't as good a fit for the United States after the Cold War as it was during. And one of the observations you make there, this is a quote from the piece, you say the U.S. was not really comfortable as an imperial global watchdog. To what do you attribute that?
Well, part of it's to our traditions that we were, from the Constitution, we were sort of isolationists. We did get involved. I mean, Robert Kagan has showed us that we did get involved, but we never did so willingly in a preemptive manner. We were always reactive. And this became especially important during the 2015-16 campaign when Donald Trump geared his tweaking or his modifications of traditional Republican issues by focusing on the Electoral College-rich swing states. And one of the signature issues, in addition to China and asymmetrical trade and open borders, was optional, what he called optional war, which in his mind, I think, meant bad optics and poor ratings, but in a cost-benefit business-like analysis didn't pencil out. And then he added an especially poignant force multiplier to the issue when he said, and your sons and daughters end up dying for the abstractions of coastal elites. So whether he wants to end the bipartisan post-war consensus or not, I think he's being forced by events to modify them radically because he cannot win the election without that 41 or 42% base that he promised he would not engage in preemptive military excursions and interventions.
You characterize the Trump doctrine in this piece as deterrence without intervention. Unpack what you mean by that.
Well, if a rogue nation like Iran shoots down a drone, or North Korea sets off a missile in violation to what it said it would not do, then how do you respond to that? Do you send in troops to Syria when the Kurds are threatened by the Turks? Do you, after you bomb Libya, do you put in ground troops to make sure that post-war chaos doesn't prove adverse to our interest? And the answer had always been, yeah, you do. We have 5,000 troops in Syria, of all places, and we have, 7,000 or 8,000 still in Afghanistan. We probably have about 5,000 in Iraq with count various personnel. And Trump came along and said, I'm not going to do that anymore, as much as he could, because he was fighting his own secretaries of state and defense secretaries. But his point was that you can deter people without intervening. In fact, when you do intervene and you're not successful, that erodes deterrence, as happened in Afghanistan, to take one example, or Libya. So how do you do that? And that is, I think, what he's trying to get at is his model would be the bombing the blank blank out of ISIS. That is, for whatever aggression that you experience, you retaliate disproportionately, but not on the ground. So if Iran the next time takes down a U.S. plane or tries to hijack, then we would reply disproportionately, either with cruise missiles or aircraft. But there would be no pretense that that would solve the problem forever, or that we're going to turn Iran into a democracy. It would just be disproportionate retaliation intended to remind them not to do it again, because the escalating cost is not in their interest.
If we're considering at this point, nearly 3 years that Donald Trump has in the books now as commander-in-chief, how would you judge the extremes of his foreign policy performance? By which I mean, what are the foreign policy challenges you think he's handled the most deftly and the least deftly?
Well, I think he's done the best by shattering the pretense that things were normal, or that certain policies were sacrosanct, that were utterly bankrupt. I'll just give you a few examples. I think the Iran deal was a guarantee that Iran would get a bomb within 15 years, and that's over with. Nobody who really crafted it really believed anything other than it was a face-saving measure. I think moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was very important. That telling the Syrians, you're never going to get the Golan Heights back, just forget about it, was important. Cutting off the $700 million to the Palestinians who were foul. They were not authentic refugees 47 years after the creation of Israel. And so those things were very good. And then trying to forge a new type of trade deal with Mexico and Canada, and asking the China policy, I think, is the best thing he's done, because I think he's reminded the country, both left and right, that China considered our magnanimity in this asymmetrical trade relationship as weakness to be exploited, not as deference to be reciprocated. And I think that's important. On North Korea and Afghanistan and Syria, I think he inherited these messes, and he's tried a different mercurial, hot, cold, friends, enemies approach, and sort of art of the deal chaos, and we don't really know the results of those yet. Now, the biggest problems he's had, I think, is largely one of process, and that, I mean, he's had these high-profile resignations of people like Jim Mattis or John Bolton or Rex Tillerson or H.R. McMaster's, firing resignations, whatever you want to call them. And so, although that's not necessarily, Obama had 4 secretaries of defense, it's not necessarily regular, but it plays into immediate narrative that there's chaos in the White House, and then supposedly people abroad pick up on that. But that has to be set aside against the fact that he really radically rebuild our defenses in just the first 3 years by spending a lot more money in the Pentagon. So I'm pretty happy with his foreign policy, even though nobody else seems to be. But I think principled realism, or deterrence without intervention, seems to be the trademark, and especially successful in getting rid of ISIS. Most people think his greatest fault was Assyria. imbroglio by not helping the Syrian Kurds, but they never really enunciated or outlined or articulated an alternative policy in which our de facto friends, the Kurds, which are not our de jure allies, were going to be in a shooting war with our de jure allies, the Turks, who are not our de facto friends, and how we were going to have 200 or so tripwire troops in between that, and how that was going to be a manageable situation, which I don't think it was.
How do you respond to the criticism, which you hear from both left and right, albeit motivated, I think, by different factors? But there's a criticism that this less interventionist approach is a kind of abandonment of America's traditional role as a global leader, and that this leaves a vacuum that other less savory powers will fill. What's your response to that?
Well, I think ostensibly there's some truth to it, but I think it misses the long-range strategy or logic of the Trump, if I could use that term, doctrine, which is something like this, is that let Russia do in Syria what other countries who get bogged like us did in Afghanistan, or if Turkey really wants to go into this border corridor, let them stay there the next 20 years and see how they like it. Or if China really wants to build harbors everywhere from the Balkans to the Piraeus and it wants to colonize Africa, let it go ahead and see what happens. Meanwhile, let the United States get a booming economy and a huge military, and then shore up this economic, commercial, and military power, and then be very wise in where it's expressed. And then when it's expressed, do so in overwhelming terms that reminds everybody who the real power is, even if that power is not manifest in these many episodes. And the problem, as I said in the article, is that for that doctrine to be manifested and seen as credible, you have to use it once in a while, or other people think, well, Trump is erratic, he's chaotic, we got to be careful about him. But finally they say, well, he's erratic, he talks, but he actually won't do anything. And that's the danger. Obama tried something similar. He gave red lines and stuff, and he didn't do anything. Trump started off well by changing the rules of engagement and retaliating against depots of supposed chemical weapons in Syria, and then bombing ISIS. And he's going to have to do that occasionally to maintain this doctrine's credibility.
So that perhaps leads us logically to my final question for you, which is the difficulty with any foreign policy doctrine, which is by necessity something of an abstraction, or at least a first principles exercise, is how it interacts with the vagaries of the real world. So if we're to stipulate that what you're defining as the Trump doctrine is generally well advised, is there still a potential challenge on the foreign policy front that stands out to you as maybe a bad fit for this approach? Some overseas situation where this approach of deterrence without intervention is least likely to be sufficient?
Well, obviously, if we have a credible ally that finds itself threatened because its enemies feel that we won't intervene, and here I can give you specific examples. If Israel gets into a major war, or Greece is attacked by Turkey, which is not beyond the realm of possibility, or Cyprus is invaded by Turkey's Cyprus, something along that nature, or Putin tries to reclaim the Baltic states, and we do nothing other than air power, and air power proves insufficient, then yeah, it's going to be embarrassing that we're going to have to either junk the whole doctrine as not credible, or we're going to have to send troops in there. If we send troops in there, then that is antithetical to the support that Trump garnered in the 2016 election and perhaps in the 2020 as well. But I'm not sure that's going to happen if he's credible in the use of focused and measured force when he sees that the United States is being pushed or bullied, and then he responds. The whole key to this doctrine is to respond disproportionately. So if Iran takes out a U.S. freighter, you don't just sink the boat that did it. You take out an entire airfield, or you take out an entire military base, and you say, you like that? We can continue to do this as long as you want. It has to be disproportionate to be credible.
All right. You've been listening to the Classicist Podcast with Victor Davis Hanson. Remember, you can read all of Victor's work at victorhanson.com, and he's also on Twitter at VDHanson. And if you enjoy the show, please rate it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. For Victor Davis Hanson, I'm Troy Senek. Thanks for listening.
This podcast has been a production of the Hoover Institution. For more information about our work, please visit hoover.org.